In the early 16th century, when kings still believed their power came from God, and emperors commanded armies that stretched across continents, there existed a family whose wealth made monarchs tremble. They were not royalty. They held no throne. Yet without their approval, wars could not be waged, crowns could not be won, and the very structure of European power would have collapsed. The Fuggers of Augsburg controlled more liquid capital than any ruling house on earth, and their ledgers held the debts of emperors, popes, and kingdoms. But how does a family of weavers rise to command the financial fate of empires? And what price do such men pay when they become more powerful than the kings they serve? The story begins not in palaces, but in the workshops of Augsburg, a prosperous trading city in southern Germany. In the mid-14th century, Hans Fugger arrived from the village of Graben, a weaver by trade with ambition sharpened by hardship. Augsburg stood at the crossroads of European commerce, where Italian merchants brought silk and spices north, and German craftsmen sent textiles and metalwork south. Hans understood that fortune favored those who controlled not just goods, but the networks that moved them. He wove cloth, yes, but more importantly, he wove connections. By the time of his death, the Fugger name carried weight in the guilds and marketplaces, though the family remained firmly within the merchant class, prosperous but unremarkable. It was his grandson, Jakob, who transformed the family from comfortable traders into financial titans. Born in 1459, Jakob entered the world during an age of transformation. The printing press was spreading knowledge and unrest in equal measure. New sea routes were being charted. The old feudal certainties were crumbling, and those with vision could reshape the world. Jakob possessed that vision with almost frightening clarity. While his brothers managed the family's textile operations, Jakob trained as a bookkeeper and studied the flow of money with the intensity of a scholar deciphering sacred texts. He recognized a fundamental truth that would define his career. Goods could be stolen, armies could be defeated, but debt was eternal. Jakob turned his attention to mining, specifically the silver and copper deposits of the Tyrolean Alps and Hungary. These were not simple business ventures. European mines had been worked for centuries, and by the late 15th century, many were considered exhausted or unprofitable. Jakob saw potential where others saw only risk. He offered desperate mine owners something revolutionary: capital in exchange not for ownership, but for exclusive rights to their output. The Fuggers would finance the expensive work of deeper shafts, better equipment, and more workers. In return, they controlled the sale of every ounce of metal extracted. It was a system that transferred risk away from the Fuggers and profit toward them, and it worked with devastating efficiency. Within decades, the Fugger family controlled significant portions of European copper and silver production, the raw materials that minted coins, forged cannons, and built the infrastructure of power. But metal alone does not make empires, and Jakob understood that the real power lay not in what you owned, but in whom you could make dependent upon you. In 1493, Maximilian of Habsburg needed money desperately. The heir to the Holy Roman Empire faced rebellion, rivalry, and the constant threat of French expansion. Traditional lenders were cautious, demanding impossible collateral or interest rates that would bankrupt any borrower. Jakob offered terms that seemed generous: reasonable interest, flexible repayment, and a willingness to extend credit that no one else would risk. The cost, however, wasn't measured in interest alone. Maximilian granted the Fuggers mining rights, trade monopolies, and political favors that opened doors across the empire. More crucially, he became reliant on Fugger financing for his very survival as a ruler. The relationship established a pattern that would repeat across Europe. Rulers needed money to fight wars, secure alliances, and maintain their courts, and Jakob Fugger was the man who could provide it, always at a price that extended his influence further. When Maximilian died in 1519, the question of succession threatened to tear Europe apart. His grandson Charles, already King of Spain, sought to claim the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Francis I of France opposed him with equal determination. The decision lay with 7 prince-electors, powerful nobles whose votes could be swayed by persuasion, tradition, or more tangible incentives. Charles needed an enormous sum to secure their loyalty through bribes, promises, and displays of wealth. He needed more money than any treasury could provide on short notice. He needed Jakob Fugger. The election of 1519 became a financial contest as much as a political one. Jakob assembled a consortium of bankers, but the Fuggers provided the lion's share, over 500,000 florins, a sum so staggering that contemporaries struggled to comprehend its magnitude. It represented the annual tax revenue of entire kingdoms. With this money, Charles purchased the Imperial crown. The electors received their gold, and Europe received an emperor who owed his throne to a banker in Augsburg. Francis of France, despite his kingdom's wealth, could not match the Fuggers' financial power. The lesson was unmistakable. Credit had become the currency of power, and those who controlled credit controlled the fate of nations. Jakob's influence extended beyond secular rulers. The Catholic Church, vast and wealthy as it was, constantly required money for construction, administration, and the political machinations necessary to maintain spiritual authority over fractious kingdoms. When Pope Leo X sought funds to complete St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, he turned to a controversial but effective method: the sale of indulgences. These documents promised spiritual benefits, including reduction of time in purgatory, in exchange for monetary contributions. The practice was theologically dubious and morally troubling to many, but it generated enormous revenue. The collection and transfer of this money, however, required a sophisticated financial network. Jakob Fugger provided it. His agents collected indulgence money across Germany and transferred it to Rome, taking a percentage as their fee. The system worked with mechanical efficiency, and the Fuggers profited from both the spiritual anxieties of common believers and the architectural ambitions of the papacy. This arrangement had consequences that Jakob could not have foreseen, or perhaps did not care to consider. In 1517, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther witnessed the sale of indulgences in his region and was appalled by what he saw as the commodification of salvation. His 95 theses, initially intended as scholarly debate, ignited religious upheaval that would fracture Christianity and plunge Europe into generations of war. The Fuggers' financial machinery had helped create the conditions for the Reformation, though they themselves remained staunchly Catholic and continued to profit from both sides of the religious divide whenever possible. The methods Jakob employed to maintain his empire were as sophisticated as they were ruthless. He established a network of agents and correspondents across Europe, creating what amounted to the continent's first multinational financial corporation. These agents reported market conditions, political developments, and opportunities for profit with remarkable speed and accuracy. The Fuggers maintained their own courier system, faster and more reliable than most royal postal services. Information became as valuable as gold, and Jakob wielded both with precision. He knew which mines were producing, which monarchs were desperate, which wars were brewing before most kings learned the news. This intelligence network allowed him to anticipate market movements, secure advantageous contracts, and position himself as the indispensable financier whenever crisis emerged. Jakob's relationship with the Habsburgs deepened with each transaction, binding the family ever more tightly to the dynasty's fate. When Charles V inherited not only the imperial title, but also the Spanish throne with its vast overseas territories, the scale of borrowing reached unprecedented levels. The Spanish crown had access to silver flowing from the mines of Potosi in the New World, wealth that seemed limitless. Yet somehow the expenses always exceeded the revenues. Charles waged war against France, against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant princes within his own domains. Each campaign required upfront capital that only the Fuggers and a few other great banking houses could provide. The arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. Charles received the funds to maintain his empire, and the Fuggers received interest payments along with monopolies, trade rights, and political influence that extended their commercial reach across the known world. Yet beneath this surface of mutual advantage, tensions festered. Jakob was not beloved. He was feared and resented. The German princes saw him as an upstart who had disrupted the traditional social order. The lesser merchants despised him for his monopolistic practices. The common people blamed him for inflation and economic hardship, not understanding that the flood of New World silver, not Fugger machinations, was destabilizing prices across Europe. Religious reformers identified him as a symbol of everything corrupt about the old order, a man who profited from the sale of salvation itself. Even those who borrowed from him felt the sting of dependency. There exists a famous letter, perhaps apocryphal, but certainly revealing, in which Jakob reminded Charles V of his debts with extraordinary bluntness. "It is well known," he reportedly wrote, "that your imperial majesty could not have acquired the Roman crown without my help." The tone was not that of a supplicant, but of a man stating obvious facts to someone who had forgotten them. Such directness from a mere banker to an emperor shocked contemporaries, but Jakob understood that his power rested not on deference, but on the cold mathematics of debt. Jakob Fugger died in 1525, one of the wealthiest private individuals in human history. His fortune, adjusted for the economic conditions of his time, rivaled or exceeded that of any living person. He had financed emperors, popes, and kingdoms. He had turned mining and banking into instruments of geopolitical power. Yet he died without heirs, his vast wealth passing to his nephew Anton, who proved equally capable of managing the family empire. Anton, known as Anton the Rich, inherited not just wealth, but also the web of obligations, contracts, and dependencies that Jakob had spent a lifetime constructing. For a time, the system continued to function. The Fuggers remained essential to Habsburg power, and their agents operated across Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in the Low Countries, wherever money moved and power concentrated. But dominance built on debt is always precarious. The Habsburg emperors who owed everything to Fugger money proved unreliable debtors. Charles V and his successor Philip II of Spain borrowed staggering sums to wage wars across Europe and the Mediterranean. They fought the Ottoman Turks at Lepanto, suppressed Protestant rebellions in the Netherlands, attempted to invade England with the ill-fated Armada, and maintained garrisons and fleets across a global empire that stretched from Vienna to the Philippines. The costs were ruinous, and the revenues from distant colonies, though vast, never quite matched the expenditures. The Spanish crown began to default, first subtly through delayed payments and devalued currencies, then more openly through bankruptcy declarations. In 1557, Philip II declared Spain bankrupt, suspending all debt payments. The Fuggers and other creditors suddenly held paper promises from the most powerful monarchy in Europe that were effectively worthless. Negotiations followed, restructuring agreements were reached, and eventually some fraction of the debts were acknowledged. But the damage was done. The Fuggers had extended enormous credit based on the assumption that imperial power guaranteed repayment. They discovered, as creditors throughout history have discovered, that borrowers who are too powerful to fail are also too powerful to force into compliance. When the debtor commands armies and the creditor commands only ledgers, the balance of power becomes uncomfortably clear. Philip declared bankruptcy again in 1575, and yet again in 1596. Each time, the great banking houses scrambled to salvage what they could, accepting reduced payments, extended timelines, and acknowledgments that were worth less than the paper they were written on. The Fuggers, who had once dictated terms to emperors, now found themselves supplicants hoping to recover fragments of what they were owed. The family never recovered its former position. The metal markets they had once dominated shifted as New World silver flooded Europe, destabilizing the careful equilibrium Jakob had constructed. The price of copper and silver fluctuated wildly, undermining the monopolies that had been the foundation of Fugger wealth. New banking families emerged, some learning from Fugger methods, others avoiding the trap of lending to insolvent monarchs. The Medici had already declined. The Fuggers now followed. They retreated from high finance, reinvesting their remaining wealth in land, titles, and safer ventures. They became what Jakob had once refused to be, merely very rich nobles, comfortable, but no longer decisive. The family did not disappear. They purchased estates, built palaces, married into aristocracy, and secured titles that transformed them from merchants into nobility. The Fuggeri, a housing complex Jakob had established in Augsburg to provide affordable housing for the poor, still exists today, a rare example of 16th-century philanthropy that endured. But the age of Fugger dominance had ended, swept away by the very forces they had helped unleash. The rise of nation-states with their own developing financial instruments, the flooding of European markets with precious metals from the Americas, the fracturing of religious unity that made old alliances unstable, all these changes eroded the foundations of the Fugger system. The Fugger story illuminates a paradox at the heart of financial power. They rose by making themselves indispensable, by becoming the only source of capital that could fund the ambitions of emperors and popes. But that very indispensability made them vulnerable. Kings who owe fortunes they cannot repay do not fear their creditors. They resent them. Debts that cannot be collected become worthless, and power built on ledgers proves fragile when monarchs decide that bankruptcy is preferable to repayment. The Fuggers financed empires, but they could not control the men who wore the crowns, and in the end, that distinction mattered more than all the gold in Augsburg. What remains is a legacy both immense and cautionary. The Fuggers demonstrated that private wealth, strategically deployed, could shape the course of history as surely as armies and dynasties. They proved that financial innovation, the creation of credit networks, the management of risk, the patient accumulation of leverage, could elevate a family of weavers to a position more powerful than kings. They showed that information, properly gathered and analyzed, could predict and exploit the movements of markets and monarchs. Yet they also revealed the limits of such power, the moment when debtors become too great to fail, and creditors discover that their claims are only as solid as the willingness of borrowers to honor them. In the counting houses of Augsburg, Jakob Fugger had built an empire without borders, an empire of obligation and interest that stretched across continents. But empires built on paper burn as easily as any other, and when the Habsburgs defaulted, the flames consumed a century of calculated ambition, leaving behind only the memory of a time when bankers ruled Europe and kings begged for their favor.